Hello, everyone. I know that it slow delays before it fully loads up all the settings for me, but nonetheless, I'm here and available. As you can see, I finally got a haircut. Very well needed haircut. So I'm very excited to go. I apologize. I didn't set up the topic and the idea until the last minute. As you can imagine, it's not always easy to conceive of topics. But I had a conversation with a friend of mine and viewer, and so I decided that for the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be doing a sort of legal series covering major Supreme Court rulings to do with race over the centuries, and I'll start with the obvious one next week, which is Brown versus Board of Education. And what I'll do with these legal discussions is I will talk about some of the facts and evidence that were introduced, as well as the legal reasoning and the strengths and weaknesses that come with that legal reasoning. Hi, Nicole. Welcome. That come with that legal reasoning because it's important to understand why the justices did, but also some instructive cases that I suspect are not generally known, mostly from the 1920s, that have to do with essentially how the courts drew the racial line. So I'll be covering that. Hi, Cassandra. And so I'll be covering those in the next couple of weeks. So at least I'll have topics ahead of time. In fact, I'll be able to set up next week's topic after we're done with this one, which is very exciting for me because, like I said, it's been, for whatever reason, the last couple of weeks have been very mentally straining, or I've been challenged to conceive of things. We are here, or I am here in Philadelphia. We're here in the Delaware Valley after another police shooting and killing of a black man who was experiencing a mental break. The facts of the case are still not clear. Uh, the police officers are arguing they felt threatened by a man with a knife, and so they pulled their guns on him. I will just say, just for the sake of argument, that I'm pretty sure cops have tasers and clubs and outnumbered the man. And so I don't know why 11 bullets was the solution. But I'm not saying anything that a great many people don't already know. But I'm already seeing people saying that the cops had no choice but to shoot him, as if police are incapable of disarming someone with a knife in any other way than 11 bullets. Yeah, sorry. Anyway, uh, I am talking today about Venture Smith, but first I will go through my standard discussion. Today might be a shorter episode. Maybe I always say that and then end up running an hour. But I'll go through my standard introduction because again, it's super important. And there are two things to consider. We are awash in a sewer of misinformation and lies, and Facebook, where I'm speaking to you, is one of the great conduits of the misinformation and sewage that is spilling into our society. And so I request of anybody who watches or listens that you do a couple of important things whenever someone makes an assertion of a fact. One, consider the speaker. That's not the only thing. Some people, just think like, oh, well, I'm just going to ignore something because I don't like the speaker. That's not entirely true. You should consider who the speaker is and who the source is. Is this person a credible source? Do they know what they're talking about? Have they studied? Do they have qualifications? The This is particularly important considering COVID times, in that we have these doctors being trotted out who say COVID is not that dangerous, but these doctors are like orthopedic surgeons, so they have nothing to do with infectious disease, and so their opinion to me is less valid than an infectious disease specialist or a virologist who studies viruses. So consider who the person is and what their agenda might be. uh, what their qualifications might be, what their facts might be. But again, be aware that just because that person's agenda might conflict with yours doesn't mean that person is wrong. And so it's very important to consider that. Secondly, consider the information being presented. Does it come from credible sources? Does it come from valid or reliable sources? Is the person presenting this information to you transparent about the sources of information, where they came from? Do they give to you this information so that you can check them? How much do they want you, and feel confident that if you were to research the sources of their information, you would find it valid? So, with that said, when I do these, I tell you my qualifications and I provide you with sources of information, because the things that I am telling you are based in facts and evidence. And I give you the facts and evidence so that if one or more of you were skeptical consumers of this information, you can read for yourselves and understand the information I am presenting to you. I'm wearing my Tugsa t-shirt, which is the Temple University Graduate Student Association. I was co-president of the Grad Student Union while I was there, which was very important. And we have a Douglas quote on the back about having to demand a share of power, because people with power don't just give you power out of the goodness of their heart. It must be demanded. But anyway, this brings up the fact that I am a PhD in urban education from Temple University. I have held this PhD for 10 years. I teach history and African American history at Rowan College of Burlington County, though they're cutting courses, so I only have one class next semester. Although I'm sure they'll still pack 40 or 50 students into it, because they are increasing our workloads, cutting our courses, and freezing our pay. Terrific. This is why we need unions. But I hold my undergraduate degree in history and African American studies from Harvard University, and I'm proud to say that Kristen Welker, the moderator of that third presidential debate and local Philly gal journalist starting at NBC 10 here, she was one of my classmates in history tutorial. And the history tutorial we took together was about using newspapers and mass media as historical sources. So Welker has always been on that path to journalism, and by all accounts, she did an excellent job moderating that debate, and she is an excellent, excellent human being. So, just that aside. So, I have background, I've studied. Some of my faculty are some really big names who've just really done the work, and I'm very proud to have studied with them and learned from them. Jamaica Kincaid, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, Henry Louis Gates Jr., K. Anthony Appiah, Kwame Anthony Appiah, James Laurent Mattori, Werner Solars, who's a German scholar who earned his PhD at the same school where Du Bois earned his PhD, the University of Berlin. So, anyway, it's my privilege to pass on what I have learned to you, and I hope that in doing so, I provide you with information and ideas that you can pass on further, so that way, what I learned from extraordinary people can be passed on further and make us all better educated human beings. So, the topic of today, with that very lengthy introduction, is Venture Smith. And when I teach this course, when I teach African American history, I use individual lives as illustrations of broader points and examples. And the life of Venture Smith, as recounted in his own autobiography, which I will link to, because remember, I give you the links, I give you the receipts, in a book called A Narrative of the Life and Adventures of Venture, a Native of Africa, but resident above 60 years in the United States, related by himself, printed in 1798. His life teaches us so many different things and illustrates so many different realities. The subtitle of this is The Origins of the Wealth Gap. And we know there are many reasons and ways to account for the wealth gap in American society, but Venture Smith illustrates some very important facts of this wealth gap. So, who's Venture Smith? Well, he was originally named Brotier. He's from Africa, He accounts that he is from a part of Africa called Dukandara in Guinea, which doesn't mean very much because most of West Africa was called Guinea, going back to Adam Rubin's question of 2 3 weeks ago about Portugal. They called all of West Africa Guinea, although there is, of course, today the Republic of Guinea and the Republic of Guinea-Bissau. So there's two countries called Guinea at the moment. But he was the eldest son of the first wife in a polygamous marriage family, and his father was a man of some import, whether he was the chief or the village leader or a king, even Brotier, as his father called him, is not entirely certain. He calls him a prince of the tribe, but prince doesn't mean necessarily he's the heir to the kingdom, because a prince is a word generally reserved just for royalty in general. What I mean is they would call King George III our prince, even though he was the king. So just keep that in mind. So he tells a story of his mother taking him away after a dispute with his father over the third wife. And the reason why I'm pointing this out is his mom takes him away. They go miles from his home, and he is left as a child with a neighboring family and a shepherd, where he learns the art of animal husbandry or shepherding, right? He is a shepherd as a child. He eventually is returned home to his father and reconciled with his father and his mother. And that is when there is a war and an invasion. I've never been able to find the full story of this particular war. It might be hidden somewhere in African oral histories or in the archives, but there is a war that occurs, and his father is tortured to death by his enemies because he refuses to yield up the location of a secret treasure. And the victors of this war take Brotier into slavery along with his family and everyone else from the village. This is the 1740s. And by this point, what is occurring in Africa, and this is what I mean about how we have more expansive understandings just from his story, is that the international slave trade has been a 200 something years enterprise, and it has become such a profitable enterprise because of the sugar trade in the Americas that African kingdoms go to war with each other for slaves. They go to war with each other simply to enslave other people, their neighbors, to then sell them to the Europeans. And so this is perhaps what happened to Brotier, or it might have just been a general war between neighbors, which again is part of world history. So he is brought to modern day Ghana, and he is put into captivity with the rest of the captives, who were not just his own people, but people from everywhere around. This was part of how the transatlantic slave trade worked. He's then sold onto a ship that is from Rhode Island. Now, we don't think of Rhode Island as slavery, but Rhode Island and Newport, Rhode Island, was the largest slave port in the North. So during the era of colonial slavery in the 18th century, there's two major slave ports. There is Newport, Rhode Island in the north, and Charleston, South Carolina in the south. There's no major Virginia ports, believe it or not. And so Virginia has a very odd system. Philadelphia, New York, Boston also would be areas where enslaved captives would be landed, but Newport would be a major entry point for all of New England, and then Charleston mostly for the Carolinas because of the rice growing that was occurring there. So he's on a Rhode Island slaver. And just again, as an aside, Rhode Island, the economy of Rhode Island is built on the slave trade initially. And so those Newport mansions and those old Rhode Island fortunes are built on the slave trade. And there's a documentary. I'll look it up and I'll send it to you. It's called Traces of the Trade, which is about the slave trade in Rhode Island and in the North. So he's loaded on this Rhode Island ship, and they sail first to Barbados. And he explains that he survives a smallpox outbreak on board the ship because, again, slave trade is horrible no matter what, and smallpox is a real and present danger. And according to Smith, 60 out of the 260 captives die on the crossing, which that's about a third of the captives, which again underscores this reality that we know of the survivors of slavery in the Americas, but there are tens, hundreds of thousands of Africans who are made captive in Africa who don't even make it to the Americas because of conditions on board, because of disease, starvation, wounds, any number of reasons. And so it is an extraordinary crime against humanity over the hundreds of years. So he's brought to Barbados, but he's a kid, and so they don't want him in Barbados. Barbados is the main sugar island of the British Caribbean. It is from where the Carolinas are settled. And it is a grind of human life. The Barbados sugar trade was primarily consuming the lives of African men. Bring them to the sugar plantations, work them, hopefully they don't die. If they survive, maybe they would then be called seasoned, as again, going back to my how the transatlantic trade worked, they'd be seasoned and then maybe they'd be sold to the mainland as a reward for survival. But little Brotier is little, right? He doesn't discuss this, of course, but based on his early stories, he probably didn't speak English or Portuguese or Spanish or Dutch or any of the European languages around him. So this would have been a very disorienting time for a child shipped off abroad. After leaving Barbados with a few of the unsold captives, the ship then sails for home to Rhode Island, right? That perfect triangle. Rhode Island, Africa, Barbados, and then back to Rhode Island. In Rhode Island, he is purchased and he begins to grow up. He will go through a series of different masters, and I will not mention their names because it's not worth mentioning the names of enslavers in this case, because I want to keep the focus on Venture. But it is worth noting that Venture grows to be big and strong. And I don't mean that in the kind of quaint, like, the young man grew to be big and strong. I mean, Venture Smith is a very large and powerful human being. He is over 6 feet tall with extraordinarily broad shoulders and a strong human being. While growing up, at one point, while his master was away, his master's son comes and tries to make him do work that the master's son wanted him to do. And Brotier, now renamed Venture because it was the master's venture to engage in the slave trade and make a quick buck by selling a boatload of human beings, refuses to do the bidding of the master's son. So he doesn't go into detail. But the master's son attempts to force him violently to do so, and Venture, let's just say, resists. And they are unable to force Venture to do what they wanted to do. And as Venture reports, his master's son has to retreat while dabbing away his eyes, the tears from his eyes, with a handkerchief. The implication here is that Venture Smith, when the master's son tried to hit him or beat him, Venture Smith beat him in return. So there's a couple of lessons to be learned from this. One, which abolitionists had spoken of since the 1680s, which is that the institution of slavery is inhumane inherently, but we always must understand that also the lessons being taught to the children of the enslavers are lessons in inhumanity. And this is particularly apropos when we consider that if we look at photographs in later decades of just the brutality inflicted upon on African American human beings, there are children in these photos. And so the children are taught the acceptability of violence against a black body. Children are taught the acceptability of lynching. Children are taught the acceptability of violence and brutality against enslaved and captive Africans and African Americans. That this is a reproduced and taught system. These children aren't born as violent, dehumanizing people. They learn these lessons. The master's son was learning this lesson, but Venture taught him a different lesson altogether. Now, there's also another thing, which is the fact that we might consider that this could be a death sentence for Venture, raising his hand against the master's son, but it's not. And in fact, Venture brags in his autobiography that after the son ran away, he called for a bunch of people to come help contain him. And Venture resisted them. 2, 3, 4 men were unable to control him and bind him. In other words, Venture is a big, strong guy. And they can't control him. Eventually, after they try to wrestle him down, they surrender. The master comes home. Venture is punished by being made to hang from a cattle, like a cattle butchery thing. I don't know. It's a weird description. He calls it a gallows, but it wasn't an execution gallows. And then he is sold to another family. And this is what I mean about the death sentence, is that understand, and if you go back to my Booker T. Washington, right, people who purchased captives from Africa and made them into slaves, there is a cash investment in this situation. And so, in a perverse way, enslaved captive Africans and African Americans have a certain amount of protection because their enslaver had paid money for them and they had a cash value. And so what we often see is enslavers selling troublesome captives because that way they could recoup some of the money or get extra money depending on the case. Now, by this point, Brotier, now Venture, has grown even stronger because he is a lumberjack. He is chopping wood, and he goes to the new family and he marries. He has a wife and he has a child. And this new family is problematic. He has saved money attempting to buy his own freedom. But actually, sorry, before he's sold, let me point out this last illustrative part. There's so many different nuances to this story, and they're so instructive that it's worth discussing them all. We have a description of his size because he actually tried to escape. And according to his own account, there was an indentured servant in the same household named Hetty who persuaded them they should all run away. And so they plotted and then ran away. And then Hetty betrayed them, stole all their stuff, and then ran away from them. So when they were caught, he betrayed Hetty in return. Hetty was thrown in jail because Hetty's an indentured servant and he's Irish, whereas Venture Smith was then sold. Sorry. That's the final straw, is when he tries to run away. That's when he's sold. And just so you know, the environment, or where this is all occurring, is in the Rhode Island, Eastern Connecticut, and Long Island area on the Long Island Sound. In an era when watercraft are the main means of heavy transportation, Long Island, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, it's easier to travel back and forth across the Long Island Sound in a boat than it is to walk through the woods between certain areas. So Venture Smith's world is the world around the Long Island Sound. So he is sold to a new master, he marries, he has a child. He then has another confrontation. He hears a ruckus in the household and he enters the house to hear the mistress of the house abusing his wife, and she goes to grab a whip and he argues that it was something trivial, but again, this mistress of the household overreacts and because of the inherent inhumanity of slavery goes to whip his wife because of just some argument. And Venture Smith puts his arm in the way, takes the whip shots until he finally grabs the whip. He yanks it out of the hands of this woman who was trying to beat his wife, and he throws it into the fireplace where it's burned up. So, again, considering the institution of slavery as we see it later on, accurately portrayed in the Deep South in the Cotton era, right? This idea of a man protecting his wife or protecting his family, this is one of those elements that is stripped out of the condition of slavery. That we have these, I mean, we'll just call them what they are. They're gender norms, right? The father, the husband, is the protector of the household. And slavery tries to take that away from a person, tries to take away the ability to take care of one's children or one's spouse. But of course, this is the 1750s and 60s. So slavery is a different institution. And in fact, Venture is able to go and complain to the justice of the peace about the treatment that the master is inflicting upon his family. So there's still a sort of sense of legal rights, even that enslaved Africans possess, that Venture is able to go to the justice of the peace and complain about abuse being suffered at the hands of his enslaver. And the justice says, well, it's too late now. Wait for him to try it again and then come to me. So he does, but nothing happens. And so this is, again, a kind of weird, perverse situation where there are certain rights that are still on the book, that Venture is a clever man as well as being super tall and strong. And he recognizes that he has rights as a human being in society, and he attempts to access those rights. And not surprisingly, he isn't able to access those rights with the same kind of expectations that white people or English people could access them, but he still has some access. It's around this time that his master robs him. He and his wife have been saving money to try to buy their freedom, and the master steals all the money as part of the punishment. And so, again, he goes and complains, but there's no evidence, there's no whatever, and so it turns into a problem. Over time, he encounters another individual by the name of Smith, a free man, and they strike up a friendship. And Smith says to him, look, I'll buy you and give you a chance to buy your freedom, but do me a favor. Be very troublesome and difficult to your master. And so Venture does exactly that. He becomes troublesome and difficult. Why? Because, again, he was sold in the first place because he had tried to run away. And so these enslavers, it's all a cash benefit analysis, right? And again, this is meaningful because later on, if you remember my aspect of cultural race, my discussion on cultural racism and scientific racism, later on, the joy, and I mean this in the horrifying, ironic way, the joy or the mere exercise of power on a race basis was valuable enough. But this is not the case at the time. These enslavers are not just getting off on having power over Venture or any other captive Africans. They're literally just trying to make money. Right? They're trying to make... Oh, hey, Jay, I didn't see your comments before. I apologize. And thank you for complimenting my haircut. They're just trying to make money. And so if they have a captive African or an indentured servant for that matter who's constantly running away and is a problem, they'll just sell the person off because it's not about maintaining some sort of racial hierarchy or any of the other stuff that it does most definitely become and is still. It is about how much money can I extract out of the labor of this human being? How much profit can I make off of them? It's proto capitalism almost. No, it is. And so this Smith individual is like, look, if you make yourself problematic and troublesome to your master, then he'll sell you to me for cheaper. And then I will be able to profit off of you. But the deal is, I will profit off of you, but you will be able to purchase your own freedom. And so Venture goes through a period of time unspecified in his biography in which he's problematic, and finally Smith buys him. He then allows him to hire himself out on his own time to make money. And so he lists a whole bunch of jobs that he does. He is a lumberjack. He's chopping wood and selling wood. He is trapping animals for fur, for the fur trade. He is fishing and selling fish. He eventually hires himself as a shepherd on Fisher's Island, taking care of flocks of sheep. He's hustling. Venture Smith is hustling. And he eventually is able to save up enough money to buy his freedom. But by the time Venture Smith becomes free, he has multiple children from his marriage to Meg. It's his wife, Meg. He has multiple children, and they're all enslaved, and his wife is enslaved. And so now Venture has freedom, but that's it. And so I said that this is the origin of the wealth gap and kind of understanding one way in which we develop this wealth gap. Venture Smith is a 6'2" lumberjack, dare I say, god of a man. He is a gigantic, strong, powerful human being and has an incredible work ethic. He is unable, or enslavers were unable to control him because he was such a large and strong man. And as a native-born African, this is something that we see in the narratives and in the stories over and over again, that the individuals who had lived free lives in Africa are more rebellious and resistant because they know of something different, right? One of the great, and I don't mean great in the positive sense, but great as in large, ways to control people is to give them no other options. And so when we enter into the later slave era in America, African Americans are born in slavery with no memories or ideas of any other life. And the enslavers work very hard to ensure they get no other ideas of any other life. It's why they hate abolitionists so much, because abolitionists are mailing pamphlets and telling them stories. It's why the American Colonization Society tries to ship out and get rid of the free African population, because they don't want enslaved Africans, African Americans, to have any other ideas of what life could be like. But Brotier, Venture Smith, he knew. He'd been a free man. And so first he's rebellious, and then he gets his freedom, and then he wants to get it for his family. And so he continues to work. He fishes, he chops wood. It is a 6 and 7 day a week job, making money, 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 money. Some of it he has to spend on himself. He needs a place to live. He manages to buy a plot of land to begin farming adjacent to the Smith household, and he keeps working. eventually, Venture Smith is able to purchase the freedom of his wife and all his kids. From there, Venture Smith and his sons and his wife, his whole family, are able to build a substantial family fortune. He will own multiple fishing boats and will be a successful fisherman in the Long Island Sound, purchasing and selling fish. As a fisherman with multiple boats, it means he probably was hiring on crews to work for him. He doesn't get into that in his autobiography very much. Okay, so here's this guy, big, strong guy. He can't be controlled. He's sold repeatedly. He's finally able to buy his freedom and his wife's freedom and the freedom of all his kids. In fact, one of his sons will be a soldier, a free man soldier in the American Revolution in the Continental Army. So not only is Venture Smith an American in the geographic sense, but his son puts in the work to help create the country, right? His son is a soldier for American independence, which I'll say is different from American freedom, because a world of slavery is not a free world. So he becomes a soldier in the American Continental Army. He fights for independence. Okay, so what does that have to do with the wealth gap? Well, here is this reality of Venture Smith. Venture Smith is an enslaved man. He is a man who is an extraordinary physical human being, able to work, strong back, strong arms, able to work really hard for money and income. However, his first money and income, the fruits of all of his labor, is given to someone else, right? As a fully enslaved man, everything he worked for went right into the pockets of his masters, his enslavers. They didn't do anything for it. They pocketed all of the profits of Venture's labor. Thereby, they became richer while he was still stuck with nothing. Gap. But even Smith, his neighbor, his last enslaver, who frees him, allows him to buy his freedom, profits from the arrangement. Because Venture Smith buys his freedom. He doesn't say it, but I suspect he probably paid more for his freedom than Smith had paid for him. So Smith pays, let's say, £100 sterling. Venture Smith buys his freedom for £200 sterling. And so Smith has managed to profit through his investment in Venture Smith. And Venture Smith has spent £200 or earned £200 of labor. And at the end of the day, he has zero. But Smith has £100 sterling silver in profit. But that's not all, because he has children and a wife. And so the children are born enslaved. The enslavers of his children spent $0 on those children. They don't even have to invest. All they had to do was allow Venture Smith to fall in love and create a family. And now the children can work, which they did, and all of that profit goes into the pocket of their enslavers. And then Venture Smith wants to purchase their freedom, and so he has to work for even more years and save up even more money, which he then gives to the enslavers for the right to take his children with him to freedom. And to take his wife. And so what this means is that over time, Venture Smith, by being a human being who falls in love and has a family, has to work for years and years and years and years. And all of the profits of his own personal, his individual freedom are given to someone else. And so Venture Smith spends years working, years, and enjoys zero profit from his labor. He is able to build zero wealth from that labor from those years. But even more, all of the profits of those labors go into the pockets of the white New Englanders who own him. So not only is Venture working, and staying here at the bottom, if you will, But the people who enslave him through no labor of their own or not even working, they're getting wealthier. And so let's say they start here, but then Venture Smith spends 10 years hard at work, and all that money flows upwards into the pockets of the people who already have the money, and so they move up, 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 while Venture Smith stays at zero. This is the wealth gap. This is the wealth gap between white people and black people in America. This isn't the only one, but this is one basic source of it that we have in the Americas. And this is before the Revolution and then the early years after the Revolution, when slavery is, dare I say it, more humane. Never humane, but far better than it later becomes. So we have these enslaved people, these African Americans and Africans, who bust their butts making tons of money to purchase their freedom. So this is just looking at the free population, not those that remain enslaved. Bust their butts for freedom, and all of the profits of their hard work go into someone else's pockets. They spend years and years working so that someone else becomes richer. And then at the end of it, they're told, congratulations, you now own yourself, and that's it. No money in your pocket, just yourself. Now get to work. So now these individuals, like Venture Smith, in the prime earning years, as we call it in labor economics, in their prime earning years, have spent most of their prime earning years earning money for someone else who profits off their prime earning years. And then Venture Smith finally gets free, and he begins to work for himself, and he begins to pocket his own money and begin to build wealth. But he's living in a society where, as he's beginning to build his own wealth, already the people around him have gotten wealth from him. They've become richer through no work of their own. They have benefited what we call passive income, because the money just flows into their pockets because they have a piece of paper that says, I own Venture Smith. And that piece of paper returns gold and silver coins every year as Venture Smith is working for his freedom, and they don't have to do anything. In other words, Africans and African Americans, even in these situations where Venture Smith is able to buy his freedom, are basically like stock market. You buy them and then you make money off of them, and then you can sell them, or you just give them their own stocks and let them buy themselves eventually. And so Smith and his other owners, they become very wealthy people. They profit off of all of his labor. And now in a free society where Venture Smith is a landowner and his former enslaver Smith is a landowner, well, cash talks, right? They've got more money. They have an economic competitive advantage. They can invest more. They can buy more land than Venture Smith can because they have the extra money. They can buy more boats or more tools. They have the cash that they used from Venture Smith that they can invest to make more money. And so starting with the advantage already from extracting all of this profit from Venture Smith, they're then able to invest that money and grow it even more than Venture Smith can, so that we have a greater wealth gap. And so these old money New Englanders, and this is a situation that's replicated throughout areas, throughout the South and Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, right, where you have these arrangements. And so you have the seed fortunes of American old money. These are the individuals who become the wealthy gentlemen of leisure who get themselves elected to the Connecticut legislature, because Venture Smith ends up in East Haddam, Connecticut, who get themselves elected to the Connecticut legislature, who write the laws or go to the constitutional conventions, or, all the different ways that people can enrich themselves. And so they can build the gap even further. But there's another level that will present a challenge to Venture Smith, and that is, of course, even as a free man whose son is a veteran of the Continental Army who fought for independence, he's still black. And so when Venture Smith goes into business successfully, he will find over and over again that people try to cheat him. Now, the idea of business people trying to cheat is not new and not unique to a race situation, of course, right? People have been cheating each other in business since there's been business, right? But Venture Smith will try to seek relief in the courts. He will try to sue people who cheated him, right? We had a contract. I would deliver, a barrel of fish and you'd pay me 10 pounds. And when the time came, you only paid me 5 pounds. You owe me 5 pounds. And Venture Smith goes to court. But see, Venture Smith is an African, right? And unsaid, but as a man born in Africa who's English as a second language, he is a foreigner in the minds of these English people who now declare themselves American. And so we know there is this communal kind of antipathies. But Venture Smith as an African is even more distant. He's more foreign. And so Venture Smith, even though he is an American citizen, such as citizenship was defined in the 1790s, even though his son fights in the Continental Army, even though Venture Smith is a voter, he is still a foreigner in his own land. It is a situation somewhat similar to that Asian Americans say they experience today in America. That even though they are Americans and they've been in America, well, they still look Chinese. So are you sure you're Chinese? You have an accent. Are you an American? Are you sure you're American? That type of a thing. Well, this is a situation that Venture Smith experiences. So when he goes to court, the courts don't serve him. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. It all depends on the judge and the case and who the person is he's suing or being sued by. And so even though he can seek justice in the courts as a resident of Connecticut, as a citizen of Connecticut, he is still treated as an outsider, as a foreigner, as an alien, as suspect. And so he doesn't get the relief in court that he might get. And so what does that mean? It means, again, that Venture Smith, hardworking, industrious, clever, business-oriented, has had to surrender years of his life and his productive fortune to others merely to be a free person. And then he can begin to build his fortune. But then as he's beginning to build his personal fortune, he is competing in an economic environment where his competitors are the people that he's already enriched. And the people who are already rich always have an advantage over the people who are poor trying to compete with them, right? He owns 2 boats, but his next door neighbor and former owner, enslaver Smith, that guy's got extra money. He might own 4 or 5 boats. So Venture Smith becomes the fisherman you want to work with because he's got the bigger fleet, etc., things like that. But then he gets cheated. And so other business people, white English business people, are able to cheat Venture Smith and break contracts and not abide by the conditions and thereby extract extra wealth out of Venture Smith by cheating in the courts, knowing that Venture Smith, as a black man, as a foreigner, maybe who had an accent, right, that Venture Smith can be cheated. You can cheat him. He's poorer than I am. He's blacker than I am. He's more foreign than I am. And this is all before scientific racism and all those other factors take control of American life. And so, again, what you have is a black man who, to borrow what was a farcical statement, by the way, pulling yourself by your bootstraps is impossible. And so when they said that, they meant it as a joke because it's stupid and no one can actually do that. It was meant to show just how ludicrous the claims were that people actually pull themselves up and make their own fortunes alone. And so Venture Smith is doing everything that we celebrate as the American dream and the American work ethic and rugged individualistic freedom and opportunity. He does it all right. He busts his butt. He works super hard for himself. And for years, all of that money goes into someone else's pocket because his wife and his kids and he himself are not free people. And then, even as a free person, he continues to do, quote, what he's supposed to do. He is living the life of an American in this new country and building his fortune. And despite that, he is still cheated and has contracts broken and people take money from him. And despite that, he still manages to build himself wealth. But note, this is the point. It is not necessarily that African Americans were unable to build wealth when they were free anyway. It's that their life and circumstances and their conditions in society were such that even as they were able to build wealth for themselves, right, bring themselves up one or two levels, they're being cheated. So, yeah, Venture Smith might have pulled himself up two levels, but actually, all of the work that Venture Smith did in his lifetime should have meant that he could have built himself up 5 levels. And so Venture Smith is down 3 levels, not through any fault of his own, but because of a system of slavery and a system of growing racial prejudice, but was at that point kind of like an ethnic chauvinism, like we're the English and we're the best kind of prejudice, right? It is a system of prejudice that means that for every dollar of work that he puts in, he only ends up getting 30 or 40 cents of it, and the other 60 cents goes into someone else's pocket. And those people might themselves be working for a dollar of work, and they get that dollar of work, but they also get the 40 cents or the 60 cents rather out of Venture Smith's pocket. And so what do I mean by wealth? Well, they put in a dollar's worth of work, and Venture Smith gets 40 cents of it, and the white person gets $1.60, and now that gap is $1.20. And over time, that gap grows. Because if it's $1.20 swing, it's $1.20 after every dollar's worth of work. So the $1.20 over 1 hour or $1 worth of work becomes a $2.40 gap after $2 worth of work. You see how this, and so the gap grows. The black-white racial gap grows just on the basis of that. And then, of course, there's the generational question, which is, of course, now that Venture Smith has succeeded and he's earned, like, let's say he's worth $1,000, but there are white people around him who are worth $1,500, $1,600, $1,700, and some of those hundreds of dollars are Venture Smith's money. That should have been Venture's money. He should have been worth $1,200, and they should have been worth $1,400. That gap should have been smaller. But generationally speaking, when Venture Smith dies in 1805, he passes on his inheritance to his kids. So one, they might get cheated in court because, again, they're black. And you can cheat those foreign types, right? But that fortune gets passed on among the wealthy whites. His former enslavers get to pass on all of that excess wealth to their kids, who then get to use that excess wealth to build even more wealth, and the gap will continue to grow. And so even before slavery ends, even before Jim Crow laws, even before all of these things, even Africans and African Americans who are free people who bought their freedom, because by and large, that's the only way you had free people in America, not everyone obviously, I said by and large, was because someone purchased their freedom. We have this racial wealth gap that emerges because of the circumstances of slavery and the opportunities that white people have to make money off of black people buying their freedom. And then the gap grows because of discrimination. And then it grows further. And then as you look further into history, we see examples like the racial massacre in Tulsa, which destroyed black communities. And we see racial massacres that destroy black businesses. So not only is there this gap because of pre-existing conditions, but then even after slavery, when African Americans are now free completely and beginning to build their wealth, they will find their businesses and homes destroyed, and they're forced to rebuild from zero again. And this is why the racial wealth gap in America is a persistent problem. Because think about this, African Americans, their ancestors, by and large, are some of the oldest original inhabitants of this country. And many of them are free people, even before the revolution, right? Based on kind of the general trajectory, that should mean, as some of the oldest inhabitants of this country, they should be among the wealthiest inhabitants of this country because they've been able to make money and pass it on to their kids. But that doesn't happen. African Americans are screwed out of their family fortunes because of slavery. And that money doesn't disappear, it goes into the pockets of their contemporaries and white people whose roots lay as deeply back in the history. And so we have a gap in the wealth that is passed down from generation to generation over hundreds of years that exists between the descendants of the white English, Scottish, Dutch, French Protestant, etc., settlers of the Americas and the African and African American settlers of America. And that, of course, is going to matter over generations, even independent of political and civil rights, which, of course, are also huge barriers and huge challenges in the black community today. But that wealth gap, if it didn't exist, if we could have snuffed it out at the very beginning, right? If somehow African Americans and Africans, when they got their freedom, got all the money they had earned, you would have had a society by the time of the American Revolution where there would have been wealthy black landowners sitting in the room in Philadelphia. And what would that have meant? That meant that their issues would have been heard. That means slavery ends earlier. That means black representation in government is just a normal thing because, of course, anybody with money can get in government, and both white people and black people have money. Our entire society changes if African Americans are able to keep the wealth that they created. All right. I think I made my point. So, Venture Smith teaches us about how the wealth gap, or one way that the wealth gap originates in this country, how people who have the deepest roots in this country, whose ancestors, rather, can still be struggling to survive day to day, even though they have worked and earned money in this country for generations and generations going back to before the revolution, before this was a country, when it was still colonies. And so this is a real factor in understanding kind of some of the dislocation in our society and the injustice that we face. So when people talk about reparations, we have to understand it's not just reparations for people who were enslaved and made all those fortunes for the families of today's Southern senators and representatives, but also for the fortunes of New Englanders and New Yorkers and Pennsylvanians who also profited off the slave trade. But it's also the fact that we have to look back to the ways in which African aspirations were cheated through the generations, and they were unable to profit off the fruits of their own labor, and that the fruits of their own labor enriched other people, even in circumstances of independence and freedom. And Venture Smith shows us that. But he also shows us the hopeful bits, right? That he's able to be rebellious and survive. He's able to stand up for himself and survive. That Africans and African Americans never passively accepted their circumstances. That they always resisted and they always pushed it, the boundaries of their resistance, went as far as they could go safely. And Smith goes pretty darn far and comes out the other end a free man who builds a considerable fortune, is able to pass wealth on to his children. The only problem, of course, is it's not as much wealth as he should have been able to pass on to his children. All right, any questions out there? Nope. I will say, those of you African Americans who are listening, go into your family stories as much as you can, because who knows where you might even still have actionable standing for legal cases, or just to understand where your family's roots and how you connect the work that your ancestors did. But then also, if you look at the wealth that you've inherited from previous generations, I hope you can appreciate just how extraordinary that was. That the odds stacked against your ancestors to accumulate that wealth and to pass it on to you means that they were extraordinary people. Because most human beings, most people in circumstances of racism and discrimination were unable to accumulate enough wealth. And so, whatever, whether it be a dollar or an heirloom or a gold clock, that was an extremely dear and valuable item because the odds and the society were against that being an item that could be passed down as wealth through the generations. So appreciate those sacrifices and appreciate the extraordinary efforts to help build what it is you've been able to get from your ancestors. In terms of material wealth, there's far more than material wealth, of course, right? Spiritual strength and endurance, but understand the efforts. Alrighty. I'm going to call it a day for today. Oh, I went an hour again anyway. Good Lord. Okay. Maybe next week I won't be an hour. Next week I'm gonna go deep into the legal weeds of Brown versus Board of Education, and that's the obvious one. The ones after that are gonna be a little less obvious and a little more interesting. So I'm starting my legal series next week. Yes, Cassandra. Thank you. Cassandra made the point that despite his conditions, Venture Smith stood for family values. I always make that point when I'm teaching the class, and I forgot it today, that, in contemporary society, we're constantly being bombarded with these negative images of black fatherhood. And this racist idea of a supposed pathology in black families or blah, blah, blah. And we have to understand there is nothing cultural about the challenges that black fathers face. It is structural. Because black fathers, like any father, is going to care for his family and love his family and fight for his family as much as he can. But we are in a system that makes these things challenging and difficult. And so mass incarceration, structural poverty, and built-in systemic racism is what actually is the pathology that hurts black families. Thank you, Cassandra. Great point. Alrighty. I'll give you a couple more seconds if there's one more comment out there. And if not, I'm going to call it a day. And I hope you have a wonderful day. And sorry, I'm thinking about that poor man in West Philly. And I hope that day by day we find more justice and more safety for more people. All right. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and be safe for yourselves and for your loved ones. Take care. Yeah, sadly, Jay, I agree. I'll post the link to Venture Smith's his autobiography, and there's also a short article I found on Connecticut History that actually shows his burial ground and some kind of visuals about his life. Take care.